Welcome to Doctorates of the Absurd, your provider of belief on demand.
And thank you, the listener, for entrusting us with the stack of sources that make up this deep dive.
Today, we are strapping in. This is, well, it's one of the most intellectually challenging, but also one of the most profoundly necessary explorations of political power you'll probably ever encounter.
Absolutely. The mission today sounds simple, but it's anything but.
We're tackling this fundamental tension, this friction between what we see, the massive visible social structures of the world and the invisible, almost chaotic forces that actually decide their fate.
Exactly. When we think of power, we tend to look up. We follow that rigid vertical line.
Right. To the presidents, the CEOs, the generals, the declared social classes, the things you can name and count.
And that right there is the mistake our sources are arguing we have to correct. We're being forced to look down, deep beneath the surface.
To understand that society isn't just structured by hierarchy. It's structured by something they call segmentarity.
Yes, and how the smallest movements, these seemingly insignificant trickles of desire and belief, these micro effects, can ultimately bring the grandest empires, the most solid ideologies, crashing down.
So we're shifting from the Molar map of the world
to the molecular flow underneath it.
And that really is the existential itch we're scratching today, isn't it? That nagging problem.
It is.
We build these massive predictable things, states, governments, social classes, these big dualisms.
But they're constantly being undermined by these chaotic molecular flows.
And it leads to this central, really disturbing question that drives this whole thing. Why do grand revolutions, which are built on those big, visible molar structures, so often break down into these small, intense cruelties, these localized tyrannies?
And maybe even more importantly, why do people sometimes desire their own repression?
The problem isn't just that power structures exist. The problem is that we're completely blinded by the wrong scale of analysis.
Right. So the villain of our deep dive today isn't a person or a state. It's an idea. It's the notion that politics is defined solely by what the sources call molar aggregates.
Okay, molar aggregates, let's break that down. These are the big, easily quantifiable segments, right?
Precisely.
Class war, East versus West, capital versus labor.
Democrat versus Republican. The fixed blocks. The things you can totalize and put on a spreadsheet.
This whole machine of rigid segmentarity,
Yeah.
the way society organizes itself into these fixed counted lines, it blinds us.
It blinds us to the true source of change, of destruction, and even of revolution. That source is the molecular movements, the micro movements operating underneath, right where the unconscious meets the social field.
So if we only fight the aggregates,
We're fighting a phantom limb. The real battle is elsewhere.
and the high stakes, if we ignore this, are, well, they're monumental. We completely misunderstand huge historical moments.
We certainly missed the true nature of something like the May '68 uprising in France, which we'll get into. We were looking at the unions, at the parties.
At the molar level.
And we missed the molecular eruption completely. We also fail to recognize where truly dangerous things like fascism come from. We wrongly define it as just a top-down, totalitarian state thing.
When it's actually something much more viral, much more internal.
Exactly. So if we only fight on that molar level, we just stay fearful and rigid. We're perpetually focused on the big central hierarchy, and we're fighting the wrong battles on completely the wrong scale.
So to get any real insight, we have to constantly distinguish between two systems that are always running at the same time.
Always. First, there's the molar, or rigid segmentary line. That's what totalizes, fixes, and structures everything.
And then there's the molecular, or the quantum flow.
And that's what decodes, mutates, and escapes. The two are in a constant battle, but also a constant necessary coexistence. You can't have one without the other.
Okay, let's unpack this core idea then. Segmentarity. Before we can even get to the flows, we have to talk about the segments that are supposed to contain them.
We do. And the sources insist on this point. The human being is fundamentally a segmentary animal.
It's not a choice. It's our foundational operating principle. We live our whole lives segmented in every direction.
It's an anthropological constant, a biological one. It's in every stratum that makes us up.
From the way we organize our homes, dividing a house into these very specific, rigid rooms.
To our work life. A factory operation, an office floor, it's all broken down into specific tasks. And our social life is completely structured by institutions.
And the sources break this down into three inseparable figures that are always overlapping. First, there's binary segmentarity.
This is the big one, the segmentation that follows the great fundamental dualisms.
Social classes, men, women, adults, children.
Those in charge and those who follow orders. They're the simplest, most basic divisions we use to sort reality.
Then second, you have circular segmentarity.
Right. This one involves ever larger concentric circles. Think of ripples in a pond.
So it organizes scale and belonging. My affairs, my families, my neighborhoods.
My cities, my countries, all the way out to the worlds. It sets up these relationships of proximity and influence.
And finally, there's linear segmentarity.
This one organizes life along a straight line, like a conveyor belt. Each segment is an episode or a proceeding.
So you get processed through one segment, like the family.
And then into the next, which is school, then the army or university, and finally into the job market.
And as soon as you finish one, the next one tells you, hey, you're no longer defined by the rules of that last segment.
Precisely. The school defines you against the family, the army defines you against the school, and these three types, binary, circular, linear, they are constantly tangled up with one another.
So this helps us see that segmentation is just the human default. But what really matters then is the quality of that segmentation.
That's the whole game. Ethnologists first observed this in what they called primitive societies, not because they were simple, but because they lacked a fixed central state apparatus.
And this leads us to the first mode, the more fluid one.
Exactly. Supple segmentarity.
So if segmentation is our default setting, this supple version is the original flexible design, the rhizome model as they call it.
Yes, like a root system that spreads horizontally with no central trunk. It's defined by its flexibility.
And critically, it has what the sources call significant leeway.
Meaning segments can easily merge, that's fusion or break-apart scission, depending on the immediate situation. There's this high communicability between different elements that, to a rigid mind, might seem completely unrelated.
So it's like the lines on the organizational chart are drawn in sand.
That's a great way to put it. If a modern corporation is all rigid segmentarity with its fixed chart,
then supple segmentarity would be like a super adaptable ad hoc task force. It's constantly shifting its members, its rules, its internal hierarchy, depending on whether they're solving an engineering problem or a marketing one that day.
Exactly. The rules are fluid and localized. The sources noted that these societies used a polyvocal code based on lineages.
Polyvocal. Multiple voices, so multiple rule sets applying at the same time, creating overlap and ambiguity.
Yes. And they operated with an itinerant territoriality based on local overlapping divisions, not fixed borders drawn by some central authority.
And the key structural feature here is that the centers don't all resonate together.
They can't. You have a multiplicity of what they call animist eyes, the snake spirit, the forest spirit, the river spirit. Each one is assigned to a different focal point.
So there's no single central point that ties them all together into one big story.
And that decentralization is the source of the suppleness. It prevents a single macro narrative from taking over completely. It allows for what they call segmentations in progress.
Meaning the segments are constantly being defined and redefined by the flows of desire and need.
Instead of being predetermined by some ancient centralized geometry.
Okay, so that's the supple model. Now let's map this onto the modern world. This is where it gets really vital.
It is. The central is not the opposite of the segmentary. The modern state is not less segmentary.
It just makes its segmentarity exceptionally rigid through centralization and homogenization.
Right. The sources use this great analogy. The opposition between a simple segmented worm and a complex central nervous system is false. Why? Because the central brain itself is just a highly organized segmented worm.
So the state is just an incredibly rigid, centrally managed system of segmentation.
It's all about the type of segmentation. We have to see how the state takes those three figures we talked about and makes them rigid.
Let's start with the first one, rigidification of binary oppositions.
Okay. In that supple, primitive model, binary dualisms like men and women, or two opposing clans, were the result of really complex social machines. You often needed at least three groups for marriage rules or alliances.
Meaning the duality never stood alone. It was always tangled up with other segments.
But in state societies, that dual segmentarity gets elevated. It becomes a self-sufficient organization. It's imposed directly by machines that function as such, which leads to these one-to-one relationships, these binarized choices.
Classes and sexes just come in twos. And any other complexity, like a three-part or four-part system, just becomes a variation on that dual model, rather than being its own complex social reality.
Everything has to be reduced to a binary choice to be managed by the rigid state machine.
Okay, next up, the rigidification of circular segmentarity. This is where the macrophase comes in.
Yes. As we said, supple centers don't resonate together. They have multiple localized eyes. But in the rigid modern state, those localized centers become concentric and arborified.
Arborified, structured like a tree, with a single central trunk.
Right. All the different focal points fall onto a single accumulation point. It's this intersection somewhere behind the eyes, and it leads to a centralized macrophase.
And this macrophase is like the ultimate authority homogenizer. The faces of the father, the teacher, the colonel, the priest, the boss.
They all become redundant. They all refer back to a single overarching center of significance. They resonate on the same frequency, the same beat.
So instead of having the local spirit of the river and the local spirit of the woods defining reality for you,
You have one single unified ideological vision, a single point of view that every local authority figure has to reflect. If your boss yells at you, he's channeling the macrophase of capitalist efficiency.
if a government official denies your permit, they're channeling the macrophase of state bureaucracy.
It guarantees that all the segments are aligned and totalizable.
And finally, the rigidification of linear segmentarity. Here, the state imposes what the sources call more geometrico, the geometrical reason of the state.
This is the homogenization of space, where predetermined fixed segments replace those segmentations in progress that you see in supple societies.
That's a really powerful image. The difference between how a nomadic tribe maps its territory, fluid, shifting paths defined by terrain and resources,
That's segmentation in progress.
versus the Roman Empire or a modern developer just imposing a grid on the land.
The grid ignores the terrain. It imposes fixed ideal essences. State geometry gives primacy to the theorem, the fixed boundary, the fixed concept.
And this is how private property gets established. It requires a space that's been overcoded and permanently gridded by surveying.
And the wage system does the same thing. It establishes an equivalence, a translatability between money segments, production segments, and consumption segments.
Everything is made commensurable, fixed, measurable along that straight, rigid line.
The rigid state replaces all those declining multiple codes with a single univocal overcoding. It replaces lost territories with specific, predictable reterritorialization within that fixed geometrical space.
Now we get to the critical insight. This is where the real politics happens.
It is. These two types of segmentarity, the supple rhizomatic one and the rigid tree-like one, they're inseparable. They coexist, they cross over.
Every society and every individual person is being pulled by both at the same time. One is molar, or rigid.
And the other is molecular, or supple.
So just to be clear, the molar segmentarity is the big, totalizable stuff. The classes, the genders, the nations, the fixed org charts.
And the molecular is the fluid flows, the micropercepts, the desires that aren't immediately predictable or easy to count.
And they're in constant reciprocal dependency.
Which brings us to the political equation we have to keep repeating. Everything is political, but every politics is simultaneously a macropolitics and a micropolitics.
You can't have one without the other. And you can't understand social change by only looking at one.
So just because you operate inside a rigid molar organization, say, you belong to a specific social class or a particular department at work,
That doesn't erase this whole other world of unconscious micropercepts and effects that are happening at the very same time.
there's a micropolitics of perception, of affection, of conversation, of mood. And it's happening all the time, completely at a right angle to the official organization chart.
Molar class organization doesn't preclude the molecular.
And the molecular constantly feeds back into the molar. This is crucial. It means political change doesn't just happen when the big structures clash. It happens when the molecular flows underneath them mutate.
This helps clarify the distinction between segments and masses.
Yes, classes are fashioned from masses. They're the crystallization of masses along a segmented line.
But masses are always flowing, or, leaking from classes. So the whole idea of mass is inherently a molecular concept. It operates on a level that can't be reduced to the molar segmentarity of class.
A mass is fluid. It's quantum. It's characterized by these rapid shifts in belief and desire. But molar class structure tries to freeze and contain that fluid mass, give it a stable identity.
But the fluidity never actually stops.
And this brings us to this beautiful illustration from literature, Kafka's analysis of bureaucracy.
Right. We usually define bureaucracy by its rigid segmentarity. Compartmentalized offices, clear hierarchy, managers at the end of the hall. It's the tree in action.
But Kafka shows the bureaucratic perversion. There's this whole molecular medium that underlies the rigidity.
A kind of suppleness and communication between offices. a permanent inventiveness that's practiced against the official regulations.
The rigid barriers between offices stop being a definite dividing line and get immersed in a molecular medium that just dissolves them. The rigid molar segment of the office manager proliferates into countless impossible to identify microfigures.
Discernible only when they manage to align and get centralized. It's that wavering outline, that sense that the system is both absolutely rigid and maddeningly arbitrary at the same time.
Yes. You know the rules are fixed, but the specific person you need to talk to is never in their office. The boundaries between departments are always shifting depending on who's friends with whom.
And the chaos always wins in the microinteraction. That chaos is the molecular flow making the rigid lines supple.
So the essential distinction here isn't about size. It's about the nature of the mass. It's the quantum flow versus the molar segmented line.
The molecular is coextensive with the whole social field. It's just operating on a different scale, the scale of belief, desire, and imitation.
And here we have to bring in this forgotten genius, the microsociologist Gabriel Tarde.
He was writing at the turn of the 20th century, right? Well, Durkheim was all about the macro. Tarde was arguing that society is fundamentally based on flows of belief and desire.
Exactly. And Tarde said these aren't just vague psychological feelings, they're quantifiable social quantities, unlike sensations or representations. Durkheim focused on collective representations, which are molar.
But Tarde pointed out that molar representations presuppose the very thing you need to explain. Why do millions of people suddenly converge on the same idea?
Tarde's solution was to argue that imitation is simply the physical propagation of a flow.
So if a group of people starts believing something strongly, like a social media trend or a sudden market panic,
that belief isn't a fixed idea, a segment. It's a flow. And like any quantum flow, it has quanta, it has poles creation and destruction, and it moves.
it moves through imitation. Person-to-person, micro-level interaction. These are the molecular flows where the distinction between the social and the individual just loses all meaning.
We see this so dramatically in finance. Take the segmented line of payment money, the corporate budget, the fixed interest rate, the supply and demand curves. That's the molar line. You can totalize it for accounting.
But that molar line is always linked to the flow of financing money or credit money.
And that flow is mutant, convulsive, creative, and circulatory. It doesn't have fixed segments. It has poles, the creation of credit, the destruction of debt, and it has quanta inflation, deflation.
So you can linearize and segment money for your accounting books. But the flow of financing money, that speculative desire and belief that drives the credit system, is constantly moving beneath that rigid line.
It's either running dry or initiating new creation.
Think about the 2008 financial crisis. The Molar system had segmented and stabilized all the risk. The line segments, the mortgage bonds, they look solid.
But the quantum flow of speculative desire and belief, that abstract machine of mutation, had so thoroughly deterritorialized the underlying value that when the flow changed direction,
The entire rigid segmentation just collapsed. The segments were an illusion, just maintained by the underlying, unquantifiable flow of belief.
so we have these rigid lines and these supple flows. What governs them? The sources define two abstract machines. These are the pure, logical forms that organize reality.
First, there's the abstract machine of overcoding.
This is the machine that defines and imposes rigid macrosegmentarity. It produces or reproduces segments, it opposes them 2x2 binarization, it makes the centers resonate, the macro face, and it lays out homogeneous space, more geometrico.
So we can think of this abstract machine of overcoding as the operating system that imposes the rules of the game.
Right, and it's linked to the state apparatus, which is the physical assemblage that effectuates the machine. It takes the abstract geometry and applies it within limits, like a military hierarchy or the tax code.
Yeah.
It makes sure everything can be counted, segmented, and controlled.
And then there's the engine of movement, the radical force of change, the abstract machine of mutation.
This one operates by decoding and deterritorialization. It draws lines of flight, it steers the quantum flows, it assures flow, connection, and creation, and it emits new quanta.
It's the force that seeks escape.
Yeah.
And it's this machine that erects war machines on its lines.
And I think we need to pause on that term, war machine. It can be really misleading.
It's not necessarily a military.
Not at all. The war machine in this context is the nomadic, deterritorializing force, the force of invention, of radical disruption. It's the pure form of mutation itself.
So the abstract machine of mutation is what makes the flow dynamic. And the rigid segments are always trying to seal off and block these lines of flight, channeling them back into totalizable segments.
The machine of mutation is always working between the rigid segments in a submolecular direction. The whole social field is constantly animated by these movements of decoding and deterritorialization, these escapes that operate at different speeds and affect the masses long before they ever crystallize into a class conflict.
So understanding politics really means constantly tracking the tension between the machine of overcoding trying to stabilize the segments
And the machine of mutation trying to create new flows.
Once we grasp this interplay between the molar line and a molecular flow, we can finally start to understand political events that seem utterly baffling from a traditional macropolitical viewpoint.
Right. Why did the Cold War never truly stabilize? Why did May '68 seem to appear from absolutely nowhere?
Because molecular movements aren't just supplementary.
They fundamentally thwart and break through the great worldwide molar organization. And the stronger, the more balanced the molar organization is, the more forcefully the molecular flows seek to escape.
This is a geopolitical universal. The sources point out that the more balanced the great molar aggregates are, east versus west during the Cold War, to enormous rigid dualisms.
The more destabilized things become along other molecular lines, like the north-south line. This is where a line of flight, perhaps only a tiny trickle, escapes the binary organizations.
So you see Basque instability, Corsican instability, Palestinian instability.
These aren't just local disputes. They're molecular segmentations that create a zigzag crack. And that makes it really difficult for the big molar aggregates to keep their own segments in line and totalized.
It's the constant, uncontainable leakage that threatens to undo the whole fixed map.
And this perfectly explains a rupture like May '68 in France. It was inherently a molecular movement, which means its emergence was totally imperceptible from the viewpoint of macropolitics.
The politicians, the union leaders, they were all focused on the molar aggregates of capital and labor. They kept saying that conditions weren't ripe for a revolution.
They looked at the segmented lines, they saw stability, and they understood nothing.
They were temporarily deprived of the entire dualism machine that validated their whole existence.
Something unassignable, a flow of desire for change, a mutation in social relation quanta, was escaping. It started as a tiny trickle, but it swelled so rapidly without ever ceasing to be unassignable.
But the political genius of this analysis is recognizing that these escapes would be nothing if they didn't then return to the molar organizations.
Exactly, forcing them to reshuffle their segments, their binary distributions of sexes, classes, and parties. The molecular flow destabilizes the fixed line, which then has to violently resegment itself to cope with the change.
Okay, this molecular perspective forces us to redefine what a power center even is, whether it's the Fed or the Central Bank of China, the Politburo.
We assume they control the flow, but the sources define them by a completely different function. They are defined by the function of translating flow quanta into line segments.
And they have to do this because only segments can be totalized, one way or another.
You can't totalize a quantum flow of desire. You can only observe its effects and then assign it a numerical value, like an inflation rate or an approval rating, and in doing so, you convert the flow into a segment.
Which reveals this fundamental irony of power. Power is drawn from the depths of its own impotence regarding the flows.
Power centers are not masters of the flows. Nobody dominates the growth of the money supply or the massive global transactions. They just react to it. Capitalists might master the segmented distribution of surplus value, but they do not dominate the flows from which that value derives.
So instead, power centers function as exchangers, converters, and oscillators. They operate at the precise points where flows are converted into segments.
Their whole job is to continually adapt the variations in molecular mass and flow to the rigid segments of the line. Banking power, for instance, governs the conversion of created credit money, the highly volatile flow into segmentary payment money, the fixed line, like a loan that can be appropriated and assigned to specific assets.
So every central power has three necessary zones, which you, the listener, have to track to understand its true function.
First, its zone of power. This relates to the totalizable segments of the solid rigid line, the state apparatus itself, the laws.
2. Its zone of indiscernibility. This is about its diffusion throughout the microphysical fabric, the network of micropowers, the best student in the class, the janitor who knows everything, the local police chief.
And 3, its essential defining weakness, its zone of impotence. This relates to the flows and quantists can only convert, but can never control or define. It's the abstract machine of mutation.
And it's always from the depths of its impotence that each power center extracts its greatest, most malicious power.
Exactly. If the Fed is impotent against the global flow of capital, it extracts power by asserting absolute control over the segments it can define, like local interest rates. The greater the fear of the flow, the harder the system rigidifies.
This shift in scale it's absolutely essential for diagnosing something like fascism.
It is. If we see fascism purely as a totalitarian state, the Molar definition, we miss its real danger. The sources argue that totalitarianism is a conservative state affair, like Stalinism. It's focused purely on maximizing rigid segmentarity and totalization.
But fascism is something far more volatile, more terrifying, and more subtle.
It is defined by a war machine taking over the state. And crucially, it's an intense proliferation of molecular focuses.
Rural fascism, city fascism, youth fascism.
Fascism of the couple, the family, the office. These micro-black holes interact and skip from point to point, and they resonate in a generalized central black hole like the National Socialist state. But they originate at the molecular level.
So it's a mass movement, but it's like a cancerous body, not a totalizing organism.
And the microfascisms proliferate because they give fascism an unequaled, irreplaceable ability to penetrate every cell of society.
Which means the real fight is happening in the staff room, the bedroom, the church council, the online forum, long before the visible state apparatus fully crystallizes.
And this finally answers that awful question we started with. Why does desire its own repression? The oppressed aren't just passively submitting. They're not just tricked by false ideology.
Desire is never an undifferentiated instinct.
It results from a highly developed molecular setup that actively channels those quantum flows into destructive paths.
So, microfascism explains why the oppressed actively participate in oppression. The workers of rich nations, for example, deriving comfort and status from participating in the exploitation of the global south, even though they themselves are exploited by capital.
Their desire is channeled molecularly, not rationally. It's too easy to be anti-fascist on the molar level, fighting the visible state, marching against the general ideological enemy, and not even see the micro-fascist inside you. The fascist you yourself sustain and nourish and cherish with molecules both personal and collective.
But hold on. If fascism is primarily molecular, doesn't that make political action or revolution almost impossible? I mean, if we have to fight a microscopic, self-sustaining desire for repression in every single person in every family, are we just doomed to micro-tyranny? Should we just give up on macropolitics entirely?
That's the wrong conclusion, and it's a tempting one. We can't give up on the molar line because the segments still need to be managed and appropriated. But we have to understand that all attempts to change the segments will fail if the molecular flows underneath are still supporting that fascistic desire. Revolution is possible, but it has to be molecular first.
The focus has to be on creating molecular escape routes, lines of flight that draw desire away from repression.
And that terrifying potential for self-sabotage, that molecular ingredient of oppression, brings us to the inherent traps in these lines, the critical pragmatics of political analysis.
Okay, so mapping these three lines, the rigid, the supple, and the line of flight, that's the object of pragmatics, or what the sources call schizoanalysis.
And it reveals inherent dangers, not just external threats from your opponents, but internal traps that can reroute creative movement, leading to self-destruction or political paralysis.
Danger number one is fear. This is the danger of the rigid line itself.
We are always afraid of losing security. We're afraid of the decoding that's inherent in the molecular flow. So we desire the rigid segmentarity, the binary machines that give us a fixed, defined status.
We desire the system of overcoding that dominates us because it's predictable. We are in flight from flight.
We seek to rigidly reterritorialize on binary logic, on whatever structure is available, no matter how oppressive it is.
The source gives this simple, everyday example. A man coming home and confronting his wife with rigid segments is the grub ready.
And the wife answering, "What a scowl. Are you in a bad mood?" That is the instantaneous deployment of two rigid segments in confrontation. It provides a fixed, if horrible, structure to a chaotic day.
The more rigid the segmentarity, the more reassuring it is for us. Fear drives us back into the simplest, most dualistic structure available.
Whether that's political us versus them or personal master versus servant, we retreat into that first line, convinced that the rigid structure, the tree, is the only thing standing between us and total chaos.
The second danger is maybe the most insidious, because it comes disguised as enlightenment, clarity.
Yes. This concerns the molecular supple line itself. When we escape the fear of the rigid line, we might gain access to molecular perception.
A kind of intense experience, maybe through radical politics or just a philosophical awakening, You attain this visual and sonorous microperception that reveals the voids and holes in the molar structure.
This is the moment of clarity. You see the distinctions that appear in what used to seem full. You notice the gaps, the overlaps, the indistinct fringes. You feel like a new knight with a special mission.
You believe you've understood the entire molecular truth of the world.
And here's the trap. This supple segmentarity risks instantly reproducing the rigid structure in miniature.
It's not a genuine escape. It's a localized collapse into microtyranny.
Micro-Oedipuses crop up. Small, localized, personalized power structures. And microfascisms lay down the law.
So you overcame the paranoia of the great molar system only to enter a system of 1,000 petty insecurities.
Everyone who has this clarity becomes a self-appointed judge, a neighborhood SS man. They possess a disturbing, unwavering clarity about the perceived faults of others.
The moment you achieve molecular clarity, you risk collapsing that insight into a local black hole of absolute certainty. You become a petty tyrant in your own microsphere.
The belief that you have a special mission quickly leads to you dispensing justice with a terrifying, self-evident conviction.
Okay, danger 3, power. The trap of the converter itself.
Because the entire chain of power is immersed in these mutant flows that constantly elude it, its impotence makes it malicious and vain.
The man of power jumps between the rigid line, commanding the segments, and the supple line, reacting to the flow. He alternates between the petty and the grandiloquent style.
And the core trap here is that the man of power always wants to stop the lines of flight. To do this, he tries to trap and stabilize the abstract machine of mutation inside the abstract machine of overcoding.
He attempts to define once and for all the limits of the flow and the capacity for change.
And he can only do that by creating a void, by stabilizing the overcoding machine within the local assemblage that's charged with effectuating it. The state then proclaims that its dimensions are the absolute dimensions of the abstract machine.
This is the void of totalitarianism, the closed vessel. The goal isn't just to rule, but to create these artificial conditions where the flows appear to be perfectly contained and defined.
Extracting power and glory from the very short-sightedness and impotence that proves to the citizens that there is no choice but the rigid segment.
The man of power fears that external, unquantifiable flow so much that he burns down the segments he can control, just to prove his mastery.
That is the vanity of power, destroying the map to eliminate the territory he cannot master.
And the final, most profound danger, abolition, the line of death.
This one concerns the line of flight itself, the nomadic war machine that's supposed to be the source of creation and mutation. But this line emanates a strange despair, an odor of death, a state of war from which one returns destroyed.
This is the passion for abolition, for pure nihilism, instead of the line of flight connecting with other lines to increase its creative power.
It turns inward. It converts to pure destruction, abolition, or suicide. The war machine, which originally has mutation as its object, fails. And it substitutes creation with destruction.
War, the sources argue, is only the abominable residue of the war machine after it has lost its power to change.
The nomadic force, the creative force of deterritorialization, becomes obsessed with its own disappearance.
And this brings us right back to fascism. Fascism is not defined by the totalitarian state, which is conservative. Fascism, the source notes, is better defined as the suicidal state.
It is built on an intense molecular line of flight, a desire for radical new beginning that immediately converts into a line of pure destruction.
A realized nihilism.
The Nazis, from the very beginning, were announcing wedding bells and death, including their own death and the death of their people. They wanted a profound decoding of society, but only to channel the energy of that decoding into absolute destruction.
Telegram 71. If the war is lost, may the nation perish. That's the normal, desired outcome.
The fascist war machine channels a flow of absolute war that has no other object than war itself. It wills the destruction of its own people just to prevent the destruction from stopping. This reversion of the creative line of flight into a line of death is the ultimate failure of molecular politics and the ultimate danger.
So we have navigated this entanglement of lines, flows, segments, and machines. What does this dense, intricate logic really mean for us, the individual operating inside this political reality?
Let's use a master analogy to try and cement this whole complex system.
Let's look at society as a giant corporate operating system.
Okay. Macropolitics, or rigid segmentarity, is the visible user interface and the fixed code.
The org charts, the quarterly budgets, the legal bylaws, the defined job descriptions, the fixed classes and hierarchies. This is the molar totalizable structure. If you print it out, it looks stable.
Micropolitics, the molecular flow, is the constant, invisible, belief-driven network traffic running underneath, the quantum flow.
This is everything from office gossip and internal resentments that kill morale,
To bursts of collective morale, entrepreneurial desires for radical change, the fear of layoffs, or the sudden surge of credit money and speculation.
these are the fluid microperceptions and desires that you can't just segment or totalize in the org chart. They're the viruses, the exploits, and the spontaneous network upgrades.
And the power center, the CEO, the central bank, the government bureau, is merely the converter, the oscillator. They're defined by their role in translating that chaotic network traffic, the flow.
Into stable, manageable line segments. The budget, the new policy, the interest rate, they are constantly trying to totalize the unquantifiable.
And the crucial political task for any effective leader isn't to dictate the UI, which is just the molar surface. It's to accurately assess this molecular map.
Because even the most rational-seeming decision, a strategic merger, a new interest rate, a political campaign strategy, is made or broken by the chaotic reality of the flows beneath.
Which continue, forever mutant. If the molecular flow of belief in the company dies, the rigid structure of the corporation will collapse, no matter how good the budget segments look.
So the takeaway is that mass and class do not have the same contours or dynamic, even though they might be assigned to the same group on the molar line.
While the rigid line totalizes and reproduces itself, the flow continues underneath, forever mutant, causing the segments to waver and shift, potentially collapsing into suicidal abolition or flourishing into genuine mutation.
We have to look for the molecular flows that sustain our rigid segments.
And, more terrifyingly, look for the molecular ingredients of our own self-repression.
And if there is one thing to take away from this intense deep dive, it is this crucial mic drop quote.
It's too easy to be anti-fascist on the molar level and not even see the fascist inside you, the fascist you yourself sustain and nourish and cherish with molecules both personal and collective.
That thought, that we might be sustaining the molecular ingredients of oppression in our own daily choices, our microaggressions, our localized desires for rigid control. That is truly the ultimate political challenge.
It changes the entire game. If the most important political fight is fought on the molecular level, we have to stop looking solely at the state.
And start paying attention to the tiny, unassignable flows escaping our own lives and our immediate surroundings right now.
The task of schizoanalysis is to map the lines and avoid the traps of fear, clarity, power, and abolition. The rigid system is comfortable, but the flow is where change and danger lies.
So we leave you with this final provocative thought. What tiny, unassignable molecular flow is escaping right now, destined to destabilize the great binary organizations of our time?
What quiet, unmapped desire is about to force a massive molar political restructuring?
Mull that over.
And be wary of any sudden, comforting clarity.
Thank you so much for sharing your sources and for letting us guide you through this deep dive into the war machine of desire. We hope you feel a little less rigid.
And a lot more prepared for the inevitable quantum fluctuations of the social field.
We'll catch you next time.